Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're joining us. Depending where you're joining us from, it's great to have you with us. We launched the Staying Sane in a Remote World series 2 weeks ago tonight. And since then, the daily drone of upbeats is still daily. Lockdown, flattening the curve, the testing, the second wave, and this has all become part of the rhythm of our daily lives. Also triggered by the COVID-19 crisis is the fact that the future of health has become one of the hotter topics covered on scores of webinars. Well, that's what's unique about our program this evening. Enter TechMeets.design. Our project handles sectors and topics from a unique angle. Jerusalem is a city with both a flourishing tech sector and a thriving design community. We go right to that nexus point where tech and design meet. Not only are we presenting the future of a given innovation sector, but also what is the design angle, in this case, on the future of health. Now, tonight, in particular, we are joined by policymakers and innovators from across the globe. So we're going to add another angle to the question that we cover, which is what is unique about the Israeli ecosystem in this particular area. I want to just pop up here a slide which really captures in a flash what is the unique angle on Israeli digital health, and I'm really putting this out there as a baseline before we begin the conversation with our keynote speaker on digital health and the future of health writ large. It's important to understand that before COVID even started, this was the baseline already, in that there was a robust digital healthcare ecosystem in Israel. Close to 600 startups and innovative companies. I think that there was a lot of what I call unique calling cards that make this a special sector here. One of them is the combination of deep tech, in this case particularly artificial intelligence, with big data storage. So Israel started doing electronic medical records 20 years ago, and as a result we have EMRs on about half the population, 4.5 million people. And that's something you'll hear about in a couple minutes from Ron Balotzer. So we have a very concentrated ecosystem here, and this makes this an ideal beta site for startups. In terms of the culture, I think that's a well-known topic, but definitely you've got here a cadre of innovators, many of whom are coming out of the military, where they have a sort of a multidisciplinary approach, which combines deep tech with a whole range of soft skills. And lastly is the infrastructure, which is first-rate academic institutions, research hospitals, as well as pretty strong government involvement in the sector. So you can take off the slide. So in order to cover the topic on the future of health, we're joined not only by a key player, but one of the most visionary, forward-thinking actors in Israel's healthcare system. Dr. Ron Balotzer is the heads up the innovation for Clalit Health Services, which is Israel's largest healthcare organization. He's also the founding director of the Clalit Research Institute. Ron is a professor at the Ben Gurion University School of Public Health and has been called into action in recent weeks to serve as an advisor to the Israeli government and to the Prime Minister's office on the COVID-19 national response. Ron, I know that you're a very busy guy, and we really appreciate your taking the time to join us.
This is really my pleasure, Wendy. Thank you for this invite.
Now, you spoke recently, and I think you've been prolific in terms of speaking and writing and being involved in the public debate about where healthcare is heading toward. And you had a very interesting formulation in one of your recent talks where you said that healthcare is moving from reactive to proactive, from therapeutic to preventive, and from average to personalized and precise. And I realize that each one of those words carries with it all kinds of innovation and really kind of hacking various sectors. I'm curious what you can say about how COVID-19 has propelled this process forward. And at the same time, are there any challenges coming out of COVID-19 to this moving forward?
Thank you very much for that. I think that it helps when an event such as the COVID-19 meets either an organization, a country, or any other sector, when you are coming to it prepared in some ways. And I think that in the specific aspects that you have described, the COVID-19 challenge found us, for example, as an organization, we'll take Lalit as an example, quite ready in terms of moving the needle from reactive to proactive care. For the last decade, at least, we have been employing proactive, predictive, preventive care as part of our ongoing fabric of care in a daily practice in mass scale. For example, we try every day to use what we call today AI, and only a decade ago we called logistic regressions, and 4 years later we called big data analytics. But bottom line is that we are using the immense amount of data that we have, that we produce, in order to identify for every single person their own risk of future events, to try to reflect it to them and to work with them as a physician or a nurse in order to turn them from harm's way into a better course of action that would be predictive, proactive, and preventive. So if we'll take one example we've been doing, and massively in the last few years, we've been identifying before every winter who will be the patients that will have the highest risk of developing the complications of influenza, and to come to them early enough and to try to make sure that they get vaccinated on time, based on many different aspects, turning on their susceptibility. We've taken that approach, and when COVID-19 came, very early on, we used data that came from other countries to calibrate this model to COVID-19. And so what we've done very early is to identify the patients that are most likely to suffer the severe consequences of COVID, to identify them on a population level throughout our entire population, to pinpoint them. And at that single day, we have sent SMS messages to several hundred thousands of them to tell them, we know it's early on, please stay at home. Please do not come to our clinics. We'll sort you out. We'll take care of you. And later on, the physicians called them and gave them the same service.
Okay, so you were using already existing technology in order to apply this in a blanket sense. What about challenges coming out of this pandemic that could take this whole process of reactive to proactive, et cetera, et cetera? What of that has been hurt by this period?
I think that while this period has made a lot of acceleration become an evident need, if before that innovation, especially in healthcare, was something that was nice to have. Everybody knew that they want to go digital someday. They knew that they're going to be going into more and more into telemedicine. And suddenly it became the prerequisite. When there's extreme social distancing, any other type of care that does not include telemedicine suddenly becomes very, very difficult to enact. And so this huge surge of interest in telemedicine and in synchronous and asynchronous types of care was a great boost. But with it came some new cyber challenges, because a lot of changes had to come in very quickly. And so there was a very careful balance that you had to hold in real time. In one hand, to introduce new ways of doing things, and in the other hand, to keep both the patient's data safe and the entire system safe in terms of cybersecurity and other aspects.
Okay, so I want to move on to some specific things about Israel, but you kind of caught me with one of your comments just now. When you say about keeping the data safe, it's data, this whole thing is about data. And that's why Clalit obviously is such a big part of the story in terms of the big data storage and holding its place globally in that sense. But you've got the use of big data, and then you have this need for privacy. And I know that that's come up in some of the technologies that were put into action during this period. And I know some of the things, the way that we were tracking patients and potential people with symptoms in Israel might not have flown in places like the US. So how are you balancing that sort of privacy versus critical situation?
So Clalit traditionally has been very, very careful in the way that it has used its data in various purposes, because we knew that our ability to provide with our members with the most advanced type of care that is data-driven would have to come hand in hand with an extreme approach to maintaining their privacy. So Clalit, by any means and any definition, is a conservative organization in terms of both sharing and letting data flow out of its organization and back. So we've been creating a lot of infrastructure and other types of solutions that allow us to provide all of these services with a lot of emphasis on work done in on-prem and under very strict cybersecurity rules. So we had to somehow do all these compromises to allow these advanced data analytics in real time on one hand, but to maintain the utmost level of information safety on the other. And we've been able to do this kind of very delicate balance, and we had to maintain it during COVID times as well.
Okay, so what in all of this, I mean, I know you've got the Clalit, really, the Clalit HMO as this sort of massive case study. As you said, it's the largest healthcare organization and treating about half the population. But what is it about Israel's digital health ecosystem writ large that is catalyzing this process in terms of moving us to this utopian healthcare system?
Yeah, so, you know, in one of the Lancet papers that we once wrote about what we call the digital health nation, we actually set kind of an acronym of the 4 I's that make Israel more amenable to do these transformations quicker than other places. One was basically the information basis that we have, and the IT infrastructure, including the unique data repositories that span 20 years population-wide data, from both the payer's view and the provider's view in the same organization. And all of that is really one aspect to it, which first you have the substrate to work on. The second concept, which I think is really crucial in that, is the integration that is unique to the Israeli healthcare system. It's both integration of care and integration of data. So in Israel, we have, for instance, Clalit is both the hospitals and the community care. The GPs work in the same organization, exchange data, and they have the same interest of working together. So there's a lot of interoperability, both in terms of the data flow, but also in the daily practices of care, which I think makes what Clalit is doing, or the Israeli healthcare generally, quite unique as compared to other countries. The third I, if you'd like, the third component is the innovative spirit, which is what we're talking about today. It's all of the amazingly prolific set of entrepreneurs and engineers and people qualified in various elements of science and true makers, people who are truly driven by doing something differently. And again, people in Israel are everything but shy. They are, you know, it really drives them. Yeah, that's a new thing for you, I know. But it's they have their thing, and they will go forward, and nobody will tell them anything differently. And that's a beautiful thing. That's what you need in order to have successful entrepreneurs, people who are dedicated and would be deterred by nothing. And you know, those of them who make it all the way actually change the world, and that's a beautiful thing to see. And the final thing, the fourth I for that matter, is the implementation-ready providers. So it is not enough to have all of those infrastructure put in place. You need to have providers that are both interested in change and able to employ change. So the IT infrastructure is part of the capability and the ability, but the fact that the institutions in Israel are paid on the long term, they are paid by capitation. They do not want to sell services. They want to keep the patient healthy for the longer term. This unique modality in the incentive system in Israel also makes a lot of innovation make sense, both economically and medically in the same time, and allows us to be the testing bed for many innovations, because it makes sense to do things that actually help the patients on the first hand. You don't have to immediately show the short-term benefits or the short-term goals in terms of financial incentives.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I just want to point out to our participants from Israel and abroad, if you have any questions for Dr. Ron Balotzer, feel free to post them on the Q&A, the bottom of the screen. And I believe we'll have time for a couple of questions as soon as we're finished. Okay, Ron, you've spent most of your professional career on advocating, designing, implementing the digital transformation of healthcare. Obviously, and I'm just reminding you, since we're in this particular special project called Tech Meets Design, there's a critical piece to this puzzle, which is adoption and design. If you could share with us what you think are some of the key principles in terms of the design element and adoption. I'm going to narrow it actually to say with patient engagement, because otherwise it's too big a...
So, yeah. So that's, we can spend an hour, so we'll do this in 2 minutes.
Engagement kind of narrows it.
So two aspects that maybe we can just briefly discuss. The first one would be a good question or a good problem. And a good problem, it's not enough that, that the entrepreneurs feel that they are important. You have to have the immediate buy-in of both the patients on their side, and as well as the providers. And if you are not able to viscerally elicit a response from the providers when it's a provider-driven approach, and from the patients when it's a patient-driven app or anything, of how intensely needed this would be for their lives, the likelihood of this to catch up with all of the noise that happens all around is fairly small. It's not enough to be important medically. It's not enough for a clinician to think that's a good idea. You have to ask who is going to be prescribing and pushing this, and to try to see truly if they would be putting it into the fabric of their daily work. And which brings me to the second point, and that is how this would fit with the physician or nurse or health provider workflow. In many of the entrepreneurs I meet, and they come and showcase their great idea that they have in front of them, that they either designed or started to design, they do not stop enough to ask themselves, will this be cumbersome in any way on the provider? And if so, one should assume, with the way physicians are working today, with the level of burnout that they have, the fact that your product would help the patients eventually, would help the quality of care, is not enough. If it is not seamlessly weaved into the basic way that they're providing care daily, to try to make them change the way they do care because it will promise better quality, better outcomes, that is usually not good enough. The human engineering of this entire process is exceedingly complex. You have to know the routines of these people that you're approaching in a very intimate way, and try to make sure when you go ahead and when you go out and you launch this, that this would fit seamlessly. Otherwise, it will not work.
Okay, before I take this now to Q&A, do you have any advice for the UX designers that are with us, that are interested in digital health, patient engagement specifically, or any advice?
It is, I don't think I'm in a place to give advice to, my colleagues in the US are doing amazing work with the unique settings that they have to approach. And one has to understand every healthcare system, and sometimes every organization works in a different way. You really need to know what you're targeting, and then make sure that you calibrate and adjust your product to fit that specific setting. And so not necessarily something that works in one ecosystem would work the same in the other. And so I feel that really honing in on what are the specific needs of that specific place that you're trying to implement this in would make all the difference. But I think they know this by now.
Yeah, okay. Still, it doesn't worth repeating. Okay, I got a couple questions. I'm going to just do rapid fire with you. So I'll ask quick, short questions, short answers, because I want to try to get these in. Risa is asking, how do you think the international distribution pipeline for medical innovation has changed?
Okay, so I think, first of all, I would say that some of the changes are driven by different types of standards. So the fact that we've seen more and more international standards, such as FHIR, and sometimes when you talk about data and data exchange, some of the interoperability standards that are some of them are there and some of them are in the making, would make exchangeability and transferability of models, products, etc., much easier than they were before. When you had to do when you had to start over with a new system, you had to fit yourself to a totally new terminology with a lot of exceptions, and the fact that we're moving into standards make it easier. I think also that by creating some clear standards, both by EMEA and FDA, in order to understand how do you adopt new technology, allows better transferability of innovation from system to system, and better discussion and better planning from one place to the other. And I think these are two classic things that promote globalization of ideas, products, and innovation as compared to past years.
Okay, so now I'm going to take that last point and go really local, okay? Benny is asking, we heard great ideas of implementation of digital technologies in Israeli hospitals. What about smaller hospitals? In the US, community hospitals have problems using those technologies. Do we have the resources to use them following the COVID pandemic?
So I think it is difficult to give a whole arching answer that would fit any setting. I again think it really much depends on what is the digital platform that's available for that specific hospital. You know, it depends on how advanced they are. When they are, let's take the example of those that are not highly advanced and do not have a fully interoperable, standardly designed architecture with full APIs for everything, which I think is a rare occasion that only occurs in maybe in the larger hospitals. Even in those cases, there's a lot of frugal innovation that can be put in place with minimal data sets. So it might not be possible to create data-driven innovation in such a setting, but in many cases, it is possible to adapt existing innovation and use a minimal requirement data set or minimal requirement IT systems in order to employ them in real practice. So I do think that even the smallest hospitals and, you know, even the more tight budgeted ones can find specific avenues of frugal innovation. In some cases, those that are not necessarily even directed at the richer markets, but even looking at the other types of markets, and they can fit them in and make them happen in fairly low resource and even with low, not as high level of IT as some of the better off hospitals.
So that's a conversation you could perhaps continue offline with Benny. Okay, and the last question, and I think you're not going to mind this one, from Guy. Is Clalit open to international cooperation? If yes, in what field and what type of partners are being sought? Good one to end on.
Thank you. Check is in the mail. So yes, that is a wonderful question. And Clalit has created this year for the first time what it's called the Innovation Division, with one key target in mind: to introduce into the organization the most promising technologies coming from startups, from corporates, locally and out of Israel, and anything that promotes quality in an innovative way, anything that promotes service in a given way, anything that promotes efficiency, which is of high enough standards, is welcome to pitch. And we will assess, and we are introducing more and more of these. Not only that, we are trying to create a platform that would be the testing bed for innovation that's coming from the outside, and would provide many of these startups the opportunity to work with interoperable, with large data sets and to test drive their ideas before very early on through the Kalita ecosystem. Some of it is being built up and becoming available, and some of it is already there. You can share my details later, Wendy, and we will make sure that people who want to approach us would have the way to do this after this talk.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I really just want to thank you for taking the time. I know that your schedule is beyond insane, so we really appreciate it. I also just want to point out that Clalit, with Ron's leadership, is actually hosting a very large online global conference on June 30th. The title of the conference is Leaders Navigating the Uncharted. And it's actually, if you think about who are the chief corona officers in countries around the world, all coming together in this international setting to talk about some of the insights that these countries have had, how they've coped and how they're thinking forward. So anyone that's on this webinar will be given an access to the registration in the next few days. So I just want to put that out there as an invitation. And Ron, thank you again for joining us. Okay, now I'm going to invite Mika Dalevich to join us.
Yes, hi Wendy.
So Mika Dalevich is the design lead and creative director at TytoCare. For those of you that haven't heard of TytoCare, it's a medical device and platform that allows patients to perform a full medical exam from home. So if you think about remote monitoring in the era of COVID-19, it's like TytoCare was born for this moment. Mika has over 10 years of experience with interaction design, user experience, and digital product design. She has a Master's of Design in Industrial Design from Bezalel Academy of Art and Design, which is a Jerusalem institution, and a Bachelor's in Chemical Engineering from the Technion. Now, we've asked Mika to join us. Again, everything we're touching here is where tech and design meet. So she's going to talk with us about the importance of design in remote healthcare devices and the process that TytoCare went through in designing their product. So Mika, it's over to you.
Just a sec. Great. So yeah, so we're here to talk about the future of health, and it's not hard to spot the general trend. In almost any service we use, we're moving from physical interactions to digital services. There is no different. So yeah, but what does it take for an idea to become a product, right? And for a product to become a widely accepted success? For example, let's take video calls, right? Which is what we're talking about right now. How long do you think this product and this specific idea took to become a successful product? And I would love if you would guess, and then I can look at it later and see how far you were from my guess. Because I was thinking it was probably a while, at least 50, 60 years ago, right? Well, in this ad, it showed the Edison video phone in the late, almost 140 years ago. And you can also see that it was credited to Edison, which he had nothing to do with, right? And this happens a lot with products too. It happens a lot with famous people that get credit for a idea they didn't do, but it happens a lot with products too. A product will usually be accredited to the company that most successfully capitalized upon it and not the company that came up with the idea. Think of smartphones and Apple, right? And this makes sense. This is because in the product world, ideas are really easy, and producing an idea as a successful product, that's the real hard part. So I found this example in Don Norman's great book, Design of Everyday Things, and the edition that I have was from 2013, and it still says there that today the video phone is really getting established as means of everyday communication. Right now, they're mostly used in corporate offices. This is because technology changes really quickly, but people change slowly. So it's fast to be invented, slow to be accepted, and even slower to fade away and die when it's no longer relevant. And why is that? Because people really resist change. We will always sit at the same place in class, we'll choose the same cup at work, we'll try to drive through this known route whenever it's possible. And this is especially true with technologies. If we have a way to perform a specific task, we won't invest time and money and effort in doing this in a different way, even if it's a better way. So what happened with the video calls? Because right now we're talking on one, and Zoom experienced 3,000% growth in usage over the last 4 months. So it's finally, we can say it finally arrived, and we all know what happened. With the corona, users didn't have the option to go to a face-to-face meeting, and now that the known path, they accepted the new behavior. So this is exactly where human-centered design comes in, right? The focus of this discipline is to ensure that the product we're building fits human desires, needs, and capabilities. In other words, that we're building something people both want and can use. Because if they don't want to use it, it will wait for a corona for ages, right? Because people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. They want to buy a 1/4-inch hole. This is a really famous quote from a Harvard business professor, which is not really true, right? Because no one actually wants a hole in his wall. We want a way to put up a shelf, and we don't actually want a shelf. We want probably a way to put up books. So maybe the solution should have been an ebook or a smartphone. How can we find out what people actually want? So this is exactly the question designers ask themselves. And we developed a lot of ways, make our bosses really angry in the process. So the first rule of good design is never start by trying to solve the problem you were given, right? So this really makes everyone angry a lot because managers want to see progress and designers seem to be going backwards when they're given really clear problem. Instead of getting to work, they ignore you and generate new issues to consider. This is not because they don't like you. This is because they are taught to think of the original problem statement as a suggestion, not the final statement. Then we try to think broadly of the issue, to really find the underlying issues and to zone in on the one real problem. And even then, we don't go for the solution. We want to try and find wide range of potential solutions. And only then we will go to the final proposal, right? So this process is called design thinking. And it's important to remember it's really iterative and expensive, like in an expensive way. But still, every good product starts from an idea. And our company is also based on an idea. But it's an idea that probably most parents had at some point. Either you're sitting in a waiting room and your kid is sick, or it's the middle of the night and you're on your second glass of wine and he's crying and you don't know why. And you're thinking, why can't they just examine him from home, right? So our co-founder, Dati Gilad, had the same thought. What if there was a device to enable the patient remotely? And 7 years later, 70 employees and $100 million raised, we have a device, an app that allows your doctor to examine you anytime, anywhere. So we designed it to provide the doctor with all the diagnostic tools he would use in under in-clinic visit, just remotely. So for the first time, we can now have a comprehensive exam diagnosis from home. This would be the patient view with the app and the device while he examines the ear, and this would be the clinician view. So we can actually see the ear or the throat or listen to the lungs and provide the diagnosis. Now, we didn't invent telehealth, of course, but what we try to target are two main issues. We want to provide accurate exams with remote data so the doctor can actually give a diagnosis. And like what Ron talked about before, we try our hardest to integrate inside the existing healthcare providers, right? With their networks, with the way they work. So use your trusted physicians and go to your doctors. By the way, of course, Clalit is there. So I'll go back a bit. But you remember what we talked about before. People really do resist change. And this is a process that for hundreds of years has been done in the same way. You would feel bad, you would see your doctor, and you were completely passive while you were the recipient of medical service. And we're asking to change that. We're asking them to take part in the exam process. And this is changing established behavior, and it's an easy process to do. And for me, I really understood how hard it is. Or our own creative director and the agency that work with us, they all have devices that were given to them, right? And we were there in a meeting, and he told me, you know, my kid was sick a week ago, and I thought about using Taito. And I was completely shocked. What do you mean thought about? You have the box, right? And what ended up happening is that he drove to the emergency care, the Taito was left and he was waiting there for hours. So this is exactly the importance of design thinking and user research and human-centered design, because otherwise we end up solving the wrong problems, right? We thought if the motivation for using Taito is super clear, but apparently this was not enough for them to change such an established behavior. So one of the things we did, and remember at this point we have thousands of devices out there and everything is going great, but it's not what we expected to happen. And we really wanted to drill down and understand why. How can we help our users to change their behavior for something that is better and easier for them, right? So one of the things we did is a pilot with one of our partners. We handed out 160 devices, but for 3 months for free, but we provided additional support tools. We provided face-to-face demonstration, this dedicated manager that would be available for them on call, and also we provided an introduction visit with a doctor that before you're sick, that you would do an intro and you would feel, you know, you experience how it is to do a remote exam, what it's like to do a remote exam. So, and the results of this were super clear. All the users that that were prepared for their first visit had a much better experience, and then they were much more likely to do a visit on their own. And in average, they did 2 visits over the 3 months, which is a lot. It's more than you would go to a doctor normally. And they also told us about values that we didn't think about. That they found this, those who had a successful visit, right? They found this very reassuring, and they felt a lot of control over the process when they had data they can look at on their own, even though they don't do the diagnosis. So this process, being successful with this was very empowering for them, and that led to repeat use and to change behavior. And of course, the corona effect was, you know, you can't deny it. It became their first choice. Like they told us that it's their first choice for primary care, but that's because known path was. So this was the first part, getting users to want to use your device. The second part is being able to use it. So we're not working in vacuum. Of course, it's magical stuff, but we still need to build it, right? So we need engineers and managers and marketers. And human-centered design is a discipline that dictates a very certain development process. And you need everyone on board to do that. And that's very hard because you need to convince people to abandon their discipline point of view and go to yours. So what I found is the best way to go about this was, and it's not my idea, of course, that's a general accepted idea, multidisciplinary design process. If you have representatives from all the relevant disciplines present at the same time, it is often possible to reach a satisfactory solution in the time frame that we live in, and it's very short time frames. So because our strategy, iteration, fast changes, and try to guess as little as possible. So this is an example of our lungs exam guidance. That's just some of the examples over the years that we tried. We try to test often, and you know, and don't assume with what we do. So when we think about the future of telehealth, we started with this, with physical visits that have been around for hundreds of years. Then the video and telehealth was introduced. It was faster, it was cost efficient, it was accessible remotely. But without the option to diagnose, it has no point because you can't treat if you can't diagnose. And now we're in the beginning of this step of our remote exams. And it's a good beginning. We already have over 100,000 users worldwide that all have access to medical care now in hours instead of days and a fraction of the price, which is a great beginning and totally beginning. But the technology changes fast, and I believe in technology really much. And we think the next step could be a lot of things. One plausible next steps would be, for example, AI diagnosis, which will allow for users to have diagnosis instead of hours, maybe in minutes, and will be much more accessible. And so, because they don't have the people there, but we need to remember that at this point, this means experience will be so much less mitigated, less facilitated, less supported. Essentially, we're going to kind of leave our users a lot of the time along with the device, which means that the design process and the design that we provide is so much more important for their experience. So how can we make sure that we create positive, safe experience for our users while we move forward? So this is why we need to bake the design process, and specifically the human-centered design, the research part, into the development process. And if we're designers, it means we have to be very proactive. If we want, to make an impact on the process, that means we have to be very close with the R&D. It means you have to learn their process, find allies there, sit with them, understand how they think, how they work, and this will help you to build for constructions, to understand your constraints better. And if you are people who work with designers, or also it's like, even for designers, it's super important to understand the structure and how the R&D works. But for everyone, we need to educate ourselves on our respective disciplines just to work more efficiently in these new timeframes that we're working with. Yeah, and I think that's it.
Thank you, Mika. That was super interesting. I have to say, knowing the device of TytoCare and hearing you break all this up and put it out on the table, I think is a real insight into why TytoCare has been so successful, really globally, in particular as a result of the corona. I now better get, I'm sure that everyone who's joined us better understands.
Corona for sure was a great break, was great for us, but it's a lot like what Ron said before. You have to be ready, right, when it happens. And we had the infrastructure, and the device had its value before Corona, and now it's just the virus. Because
Right.
now you really don't want to go to the waiting room, right?
Like I said, it was like TytoCare was born for this moment. And we're running a couple minutes behind, so I'm going to ask you to stay with us. You can just do the stop video and mute. I'm going to invite Talia, our next speaker, and then we'll do combined Q&A at the end. So I'm already inviting our participants. There's the chat, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to put your questions there, either for Mika or for our next speaker, who you will hear from. I also just want to note that I'm just looking over the list of participants that have joined us. We're pretty well represented globally this evening, literally from Casablanca to Boston to Washington, D.C., quite a range of healthcare institutions and governments and NGOs and foundations. So just want to thank everyone for joining us. Okay, so we're going to do somewhat of a pivot, also still in COVID mode. If nothing else, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shed a particular spotlight on the field of mental health. I think for anyone that's been in lockdown for 8 or 10 or 12 weeks, I don't have to say another word, but just imagine the elderly and other people that are challenged, especially by the lockdown. So I think that at least in Israel, there's become an extra special attention to the innovation and really the future of the mental health field. And so we're fortunate to have Talia Cohen-Solal with us. She is the CEO and co-founder of Genetica Plus. She spent 13 years studying the mechanisms of mental illness at Oxford, UCL, and Columbia. She then became a principal scientist at a White House endorsed early stage company that developed personalized medicine tools for rare genetic diseases. And about 2 years ago, she founded Genetica Plus, a Jerusalem-based company, in order to match personalized drugs with patients suffering from major depression. So Talia, we are ready for you. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you very much for that kind introduction. So today I'm going to talk in the next 12 minutes in 3 parts. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Genetica Plus and how we're battling major depression. Then I'm going to tell you how mental illness has been affected by COVID-19 and how treatment for mental illness has also changed in this period. So first of all, let's talk about major depression. 300 million people globally suffer from major depression. It affects people from all backgrounds and ages. And every 80 seconds, somebody in the world takes their own lives as a result of this disease. In major depression, patients are getting access to treatment, but the treatment that they're getting isn't good enough. There are over 70 different medications to choose from, and as each medication takes months to test, the patient loses months to years of their lives searching for that treatment. At Genetica Plus, we're developing a simple blood test which tells the physician which of the 70 different antidepressants to take, leading them to better outcomes, more effective treatment, and more rapidly being able to reach the right treatment for them. This saves them their lives, saves physician time, and saves the healthcare payers costs. So having told you a little bit about Genetica Plus, I'm going to talk about the space that we're in, mental health, and how mental health has been affected during this period. So I mentioned the widespread effects of major depression, 300 million people globally. It's one of the leading causes of disability, according to the World Health Organization. 7% of the American population every year will suffer from an episode of depression. And in Israel, that's 1 in 6 individuals across a lifetime will suffer from a mood disorder. Unfortunately, prior to COVID, these numbers were already increasing, especially most alarmingly in the young adult population, where you get over 50% increases in just 3 years in the incidence of major depression. So pre-COVID, we were already battling against rising incidences of mental illness. And as I'm sure you're all aware, COVID has only made these matters worse. Social isolation, rises in anxiety have led to large increases in mood disorders. 50% of Americans and Chinese claimed that Corona has harmed their mental health. One of the prescription drug prescribers in the United States, Ginger Health, reported 86% more prescriptions for psychiatric drugs in March and April compared to January and February of this same year. Over in Israel, one of the mental health hotlines, Iran, had 3.5-fold more depression-related calls during this period. So these trends have been occurring during this COVID lockdown. We're now leaving the lockdown. How do we see that changing in the coming months and years? Well, first of all, this epidemic is sadly not over. We might see a second peak in the coming months or in the next seasons. And so that will lead to a continued isolation and rise in anxiety. But even more so, these wonderful revelations that Twitter, Facebook, and Square are now going to have permanent work from home policies. This is continuing to increase social isolation for the long term. People have already been seeing an increased rise in mental illness, likely due to increased suburbanization and reduced communities through lack of religious and community engagement. And these permanent work from home policies are not going to help matters. And we know from actual scientific publications, controlled studies, for example, here in the Journal of Adolescence, that when adolescents are exposed to chronic loneliness, they show 41% higher levels of depression. And there are many studies supporting this. So I've shared some sad news about how COVID has been affecting the mental health landscape in Israel and across the United States. So let's move on to a slightly more optimistic note. Thankfully, what's been getting worse in the mental health incidents has been getting better in the mental health treatment space. So what was going on in terms of treatment for mental health before COVID-19? Well, overall, despite these large numbers of major depression sufferers, only 50% of patients, actually 50% of sufferers, get access and are given medical treatment for their major depression. Why is that? Well, we know there are stigmas. Sometimes people are in situations where they can't deal with their mental health illnesses. Maybe they're postpartum, maybe they're geriatric, maybe they have no access to treatment, maybe they're a young adult and they don't want to share it with their family members. Many of these situations you can see would be improved by access to telehealth and telemedicine. However, prior to COVID-19, everybody said it should be growing faster, but there were real impediments to that growth. There was slow adoption by the physicians, because physicians are loath to change behavior, just like Mika referenced. And additionally, the regulations were not helping matters. The FDA was slow to approve new technologies like digital therapeutics to help patient care through applications, for example. And Medicare and Medicaid, the US bodies that reimburse healthcare, for example, telemedicine or in on-site medicine, were not approving many of the many states to allow mental health remote care to be paid for. Only 9 states reimbursed remote care from out-of-state providers, and only in some such situations where patients were very far from a clinic. Those aren't the only situations where patients need quick access, non-stigmatized, via phone, via a video, to a physician. COVID has turned this around 180 degrees. The states uniformly removed those inhibitions on payments for telemedicine. Now, doesn't matter where the patient comes from. It doesn't matter what the background is. The physician and patient will be reimbursed for telemedicine visits. And just like Taito Care saw these incredible numbers, here are 2 examples. We saw 106 in a physician survey. There was 106% rise in adoption by physicians. So this isn't the number of cases. This is physicians who have started to use telemedicine before, and as compared to before. And remember, physician adoption is such a challenge. Patients want to use it, but physicians need to change their behavior. And here we see that 40% of physicians used telemedicine in March compared to 18 in the same period the year before. Novant Health saw an increase in video visits from 200 to 12,000 video visits a week. That's a 60-fold increase. These are wonderful changes. They're happening during COVID, but they're going to stay around. And people from wherever they are, whatever their stigma, however much they can't visit that physician, will be able to access those physicians. So that's a wonderful change. The second major change is in digital therapeutics, the technologies. So chronic behavioral therapy through an application, or exposure to traumatic events so that you are able to cope with them when you have to deal with them in society. These types of digital therapeutics were being inhibited by regulations, 510K, the FDA, which stopped these new technologies from getting onto the market. As a result of COVID-19, the FDA removed any restrictions on new digital therapeutics, at least for the time period of COVID. And now any digital therapeutic that wants to come onto the market can come on without requiring FDA approval. This means many new apps have now become available. Pear Therapeutics has rolled out one for schizophrenia. The healthcare centers are providing free applications to patients. And this is going to be, while it's a short term for the FDA, this is a long-term change in the adoption of apps that makes healthcare cheaper, that makes healthcare more accessible, that makes healthcare less stigmatized. And all of these things are so important for adoption in the mental health space. So to summarize, what we've seen on the sadder side is that there's an increased incidence of mental illness as a result of COVID-19, and we think that that will continue as increased social isolation continues through the future. On the flip side, better access to telehealth and digital therapies is going to increase overall access to mental health treatment in the population, and will drive down that number from 50% and save more patient lives in Israel and across the world. So thank you very much. Feel free to reach out if you want any context for people for mental health or any information about Genetica Plus and what we're doing. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. I have to say, it feels like we've come full circle because all the topics that we covered in this series of staying sane in a remote world in many ways have to do with the whole ramification of everything being done remotely now, whether it's monitoring or treatment or working, as you pointed out. So like TytoCare, it seems like Genetica Plus was born for this moment, and it seems like that the space that we're in right now is going to allow you to keep pushing ahead, hopefully successfully. I know that we're very tight on time and we need to wrap up. I'm just going to take from the questions that came in a very short question for each of you. So for Mika, if you could just come on the screen,
Sure.
looking at the Israeli healthcare system more broadly, where do you see the need for better design that could improve the effectiveness of the service? So that your designer hat on.
I think the Israeli health system is one of the more innovative, and I do look at a lot of different health systems. It covers the entire country, right? But one of the problems is we're talking about a very regulated, very hard to change field. So a lot of the times, some things are hard to change, and right now this is changing due to COVID. Not only in Israel, everywhere, by the way. A lot of the limitations are lifted. A lot of solutions are now moving faster. A lot of things are getting approved faster. So I think there's a lot of things to improve, but in general, we're moving in a very good direction. And if I would have to point out what specifically this would be, I think a more holistic approach, because we have a lot of digital stuff. Like a lot of HMOs have many solutions, like this app and another app. And for it to be very efficient for the user, it has to be a holistic view. Like what I talked about in my lecture, you have to look at the whole journey, at the whole experience, and try to be as coherent as possible, and everything has to flow right. So I think that would be the best step for Israel's products, like health products.
I mean, you really are, you personify where the two come together in many ways. And what you said is very important. And what you mentioned earlier about being baked in from the very beginning is, now.
But this is not bad. I'm saying it like it is a solid thing. This is the struggle that we all have to do, and the result is a very good experience. So.
Yeah. So Talia, just a question for you that came in is, there used to be a stigma against people suffering from mental health issues. Do you think that COVID has changed that? And what do you see as the necessary measures to be taken to alleviate that stigma and encourage people to go to treatment?
So I think that there was already a very positive change prior to COVID happening across the world in terms of stigma, across the United States, Israel, United Kingdom, etc. There was a lot of discussion already about loneliness and the increased events of loneliness and how that's impacting people's mental health. And COVID-19 has just increased the number of newspaper articles, increased the awareness, the dialogue, and the discussion. And so I think that's been really positive to allow people to acknowledge their mental illness, accept that this is going to be a consequence of these challenging times, and use these technologies. And the idea, if stigma is reduced, that's fantastic. And if stigma is not 100% reduced, the idea that you can privately download an app, or you can privately reach out to a psychiatrist on your phone without having to tell your family where you're going or tell your parents what you're doing, that kind of thing will allow at least people to access these treatments, even if they're a bit still embarrassed, or they still feel like it's something they shouldn't tell their friends about or their family members.
I mean, one change that I see at Startup Nation Central, when we did a mapping right at the beginning of the pandemic of all the related subsectors in tech, it was patient engagement and remote monitoring and so on, and mental health wasn't really there. But then as the weeks rolled by, suddenly it was clear that mental health was one of the key subsectors that that had to be dealt with. So Mika and Ty, I want to thank you both for joining us. I think you each gave really relevant and fascinating perspectives that added to the discussion. And I hope you'll stay in touch with the Tech Meets Design community. I also want to just note a shout out, a note of appreciation to all of our partners in the Tech Meets Design Coalition, the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design, Hebrew University, Huji Impact, Jerusalem Development Authority, Ministry of Jerusalem, and the New Spirit, as well as the Azrieli College of Engineering in Jerusalem. I think that the whole Tech Meets Design project is going to continue to play an important part in this discussion, not only where innovation sectors are headed moving forward, but again, where the design angle meets the tech part of the story. So thank you all for joining us. We will be sending you a link to registration for Ron Balotzer's Klalit conference on June 30th. And wherever you are, stay healthy, stay safe. All the best.